In 1998, at 4:47 in the morning, three men in dark suits stood on the porch of a farmhouse that had been in the Miller family for 3 generations. The air was still cold from the desert night, and the only sound was the wind moving through the dried stalks of wheat that should have been harvested 3 weeks ago. John Miller was already awake when the knocking started. He had not slept in 48 hours. His wife Sarah lay in the bedroom with her face turned toward the wall, pretending to be asleep, though he knew she was listening to every sound. Their son Michael, 12 years old, was in the small room at the end of the hall, clutching a photograph of his grandfather, standing in the same field that was now dying beneath a drought that had lasted 19 months. The knocking came again, louder this time, and John walked to the door in his bare feet, his work boots still caked with the dust of the land he was about to lose. When he opened the door, the man in the center held out a piece of paper that John did not need to read. He already knew what it said. The bank had foreclosed. The farm was no longer his. They gave him 4 hours to pack what he could carry. By sunrise, strangers would be walking through his kitchen, his barn, his fields, deciding what was worth keeping and what would be sold for pennies to cover a debt that had started at $30,000 and grown to something John could no longer look at without feeling his chest tighten. He did not argue. He did not plead. He simply nodded, closed the door, and walked back to the bedroom where Sarah was now sitting up, her eyes red, her hands shaking. She did not ask what the paper said. She already knew. They had been waiting for this morning for 6 months, ever since the final notice arrived in an envelope that John had hidden in the toolbox in the barn, as if not seeing it would make it disappear. Michael came into the room in his pajamas, holding the photograph, and John knelt down and told his son that they needed to pack. The boy did not cry. He simply looked at his father with an expression that John would carry with him for the rest of his life, an expression that said, "You promised this would never happen, and you were wrong." By 8 o'clock that morning, the moving trucks had arrived. The neighbors stood at the edge of the property, some with their hands in their pockets, others with arms crossed, watching the Miller family load 12 years of their lives into the back of a rusted pickup truck that John had bought when Michael was born. Old man Henderson, who had farmed the adjacent land for 40 years, walked over and pressed a $100 bill into John's hand. John tried to refuse it, but Henderson closed his fingers around it and said, "Take it, you fool, you are going to need it more than I do." John looked at the bill for a long moment, then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, over his heart. Sarah sat in the passenger seat with a cardboard box on her lap containing their wedding album, a ceramic angel that had belonged to her mother, and 2 coffee mugs. Michael sat in the back with his photograph and a duffel bag of clothes that were too small for him already. John turned the key, and the engine coughed to life, and he drove away without looking in the rear-view mirror, because he knew that if he saw the farmhouse growing smaller, he would stop the truck and walk back, and the men in the dark suits would have him arrested for trespassing by noon. They drove for 3 hours south and east into a part of the state that John had never seen before, a place where the road turned to gravel and then to dirt, and then to something that was barely a path through rock and sand. Sarah did not ask where they were going. She had stopped asking questions 3 months ago, when John sold his father's watch to buy seed that never sprouted. Michael slept in the back, his head against the window, his breath fogging the glass. The truck bounced over ridges of hard-packed earth that had not seen rain in 14 months, and John gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was driving toward nothing. He was driving away from everything, and somewhere in the space between those 2 directions, he found a sign that had fallen over in the wind. Its paint faded, its wood cracked, but its message still readable. Land for sale. 40 acres, $100. John stopped the truck and got out and stood in the middle of a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. The ground was cracked into geometric patterns, each crack deep enough to swallow his boot. There was no grass, no tree, no sign of water. The horizon was a line of heat shimmer that made the distant mountains appear to float. Sarah got out of the truck and stood beside him, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Then she said, "John, this is not land. This is the end of the world." And John looked at the $100 bill in his hand, the same bill that old man Henderson had given him that morning, and he said, "It is all I can afford." He walked to the nearest telephone pole, which leaned at a dangerous angle and had not carried a signal in years, and he found a number written in marker on a piece of duct tape. He called from a gas station 20 miles away, and a voice on the other end, raspy and old and tired, said, "You want it, it is yours. I have been trying to give it away for 5 years." John drove back and found a stake in the ground with a rusted can on top of it, and inside the can was a deed that had been signed in 1962 by a man who had died believing this land would one day be worth something. John signed his name beneath it, and just like that, he owned 40 acres of cracked earth that the government had classified as permanently non-arable in a report that no one had read since 1974. They built a shelter that first night using tarpaulin and rope because there was no house, no barn, no well, no structure of any kind. The wind came at midnight and tried to take the tarp away, and John held it down with his body while Sarah and Michael huddled in the corner, wrapped in blankets that smelled of the farm they no longer owned. In the morning, John walked the perimeter of his new property, counting his steps, measuring his kingdom. 40 acres, $100, $2.50 per acre. He found a dead cactus that had been hollowed out by animals, and he used it as a landmark. He found a rusted horseshoe that someone had lost decades ago, and he hung it on a stake that he drove into the ground with a rock because he did not have a hammer anymore. The neighbors, if they could be called that, lived 7 miles away in a trailer that had no wheels and a satellite dish that had not worked since the 90s. An old woman named Betty came by on the third day with a jar of water and a loaf of bread that was harder than the ground beneath their feet. She looked at the tarp, at Sarah's sunburned face, at Michael's empty expression, and she said, "You are the fool who bought Henderson's Folly." That is what they call this place, Henderson's Folly, because old man Henderson tried to farm it in 1962 and lost every penny he had. John took the water and the bread and said, "Thank you." Betty shook her head and said, "You will be gone in a month. They all are." But John was not gone in a month. He was still there, digging holes in the cracked earth with a shovel whose handle was wrapped in duct tape, planting seeds that he had traded his wedding ring for at a general store that sold everything from ammunition to zucchini. The first year was not farming. The first year was survival. John woke before dawn every morning and dug until his hands bled, searching for water that the government said did not exist. He dug 12 holes, each one 6 feet deep, and found nothing but sand and rock and the occasional shard of pottery from people who had lived here centuries ago and had apparently been smart enough to leave. Sarah collected dew from the tarp at dawn, using a plastic sheet that John had found in the bed of the truck, and they drank that dew because it was the only water they had. Michael helped his father dig, his small hands blistering within the first week, but he did not complain because he had seen his father cry only once, on the morning they left the farm, and he did not want to see it again. They planted 300 seeds in the first month, seeds for wheat and corn and beans that John had carefully selected from the last harvest of his old farm, seeds that he had dried and stored in glass jars that now sat in the dirt beside their tarp, their labels fading in the sun. Of those 300 seeds, 11 sprouted. Of those 11 sprouts, 3 survived the first heat wave. Of those 3, 1 produced a single ear of corn that was smaller than John's thumb and tasted of dust and desperation. John ate half of it and gave the other half to Michael, and they sat in the dirt as the sun went down, chewing slowly, savoring every grain, because it was proof that something could grow here, even if everything else said it was impossible. But proof is not harvest, and harvest is not survival. The second year brought a flash flood that John had not anticipated, because the weather reports did not cover this part of the desert, and the dry wash that he had assumed was a permanent feature of the landscape, turned into a river that swept away their tarp, their blankets, their jars of seeds, and the single photograph of John's father that Michael had managed to save from the old farm. John ran after the water, screaming, but the flood took everything into a canyon that was too steep to climb, and when he returned to the shelter, he found Sarah sitting in the mud, holding the rusted horseshoe, her eyes empty. She did not speak for 3 days. On the 4th day, she packed a bag and walked to the road, and John watched her go, and he did not try to stop her, because he knew that love has limits, and hers had been reached somewhere between the 11th failed hole and the flood that took her mother's ceramic angel. Michael watched his mother walk away, and then he walked to the far corner of the property and sat with his back to his father, and he did not speak for a week. John dug alone after that, 12 hours a day, his body becoming lean and hard and dark from the sun, his beard growing wild, his eyes taking on the hollow look of men who have lost everything but refuse to admit it. The 3rd year brought a plague of grasshoppers that descended from the north in a cloud, so thick it blocked the sun for 6 hours. They ate everything, the 12 plants that had survived the flood, the new seeds that John had traded his belt for at the same general store, the leaves of the dead cactus that he had been using as a landmark. They even ate the paint off the stake that held the horseshoe. John stood in the middle of his 40 acres and watched the grasshoppers devour his last hope, and for the first time since the bank knocked on his door, he considered walking into the desert and not coming back. He had a rifle that old man Henderson had given him along with the $100, a rifle with 1 bullet that Henderson said was for rattlesnakes, but that John knew was really for endings. He sat on a rock that night, the rifle across his knees, and he looked at the stars that were so bright they hurt his eyes, and he thought about his father, who had farmed the same land for 50 years, and had died believing that hard work was enough. He thought about Sarah, who was probably living in a city now, working in an office, drinking coffee from a clean cup. He thought about Michael, who was 13 now, and who had started calling him John instead of Dad, as if they were strangers who happened to share a tent. And he thought about the bullet, cold and heavy and waiting. He sat there until dawn, and when the sun rose, he stood up and walked back to the shelter, and he put the rifle in the corner, and he picked up his shovel, and he started digging again, because that is what farmers do. They dig. Even when there is nothing left to dig for. The rock bottom came on a Tuesday in November of the 3rd year. John's dog, a mongrel named Blue that had followed him from the old farm and had stayed when Sarah left, died in the night. Blue was 14 years old, blind in one eye, deaf in both ears. But he had been the only living thing on the property that looked at John with something other than pity or disappointment. John found him in the morning, curled around the rusted horseshoe as if it were a toy, and he sat with the body for an hour, stroking the matted fur, talking to the dog as if he could still hear, apologizing for bringing him to this place, for failing him, for failing everyone. Then John did something he had not done since they arrived. he dug a grave. Not a hole for water, not a trench for seeds, but a grave for something he loved. He chose a spot near the dead cactus, because Blue had liked to lie there in the afternoon when the shadow was just long enough to provide some relief from the heat. He dug for 2 hours, and the ground was hard, harder than it had been anywhere else on the property, and his shovel struck something that was not rock. It was a sound that John had never heard before, a dull thud that echoed in a way that suggested emptiness beneath. He kept digging, his hands bleeding again, his back screaming, and at 4 feet he found it. A layer of clay, thick and blue-gray and cool to the touch, that ran in a vein beneath the cracked surface like a secret that the earth had been keeping for 10,000 years. John pressed his ear to the clay, and he heard something that made his heart stop. Water, moving, deep underground. Not a river, not a lake, but something older and more patient. An aquifer that the government surveys had missed, that the 1962 report had not found, that existed in the space between the maps that men draw and the truth that the earth keeps hidden. John did not sleep that night. He sat beside Blue's grave and he thought about clay, about how clay holds water, about how the Native Americans who had lived here before the white men came had known things about this land that no university had ever taught. He remembered something his grandfather had told him when he was Michael's age, sitting on the porch of the old farm, watching the sunset. The old man had said, "John, water is not where you look for it. Water is where the earth decides to hide it, and the earth hides it in places that only the desperate find." John was desperate. He had been desperate for 3 years, and now, finally, his desperation had led him to something that looked like hope. The next morning, instead of planting in rows, which is what every farming manual said to do, John dug 50 small holes in a pattern that followed the clay vein, each hole 2 feet deep, each hole filled with a mixture of sand and the compost he had been making from kitchen scraps and dead plants. He planted 50 seeds, not wheat or corn this time, but mesquite and palo verde and desert willow, trees that did not need constant water, trees that could send roots deep into the clay and find what was hidden there. The town, when they heard about it, which took 3 weeks because no one came out this way unless they were lost, called it John's graveyard. They said he had finally lost his mind, that he was planting trees for his dead dog, that the heat had cooked his brain. Old Betty came by and left another jar of water and another loaf of bread, and this time she did not say anything. She just shook her head and drove away. Michael watched his father dig the 50 holes, and for the first time in a year, he asked a question. He said, "Dad, why trees?" And John looked at his son, and he saw something in the boy's eyes that he had not seen since the morning the bank came. "Curiosity," John said, "because trees know how to wait." And Michael nodded, and he picked up a shovel, and he helped his father dig the 49th and 50th holes, year 4. Of the 50 trees, 12 survived the first summer. Their leaves were small and gray-green, adapted to the sun that could kill a man in 6 hours without water. Their roots went deep, deeper than John had expected, finding cracks in the clay that led to moisture John could not see but that the trees could feel. Year 5. The 12 trees became 20, because some of them had dropped seeds that had taken root in the holes that John had dug and abandoned. The mesquite, which can fix nitrogen in soil that has none, began to change the chemistry of the ground around them. Grass started growing, not the grass that John had planted and watched die, but wild grass, native grass, grass that had been waiting for shade and nitrogen, and the patience of a man who did not know how to quit. Year 6. John found a spring, not a big one, not enough to fill a bathtub, but a seep of water that emerged from the clay near Blue's grave and formed a puddle that did not evaporate in the afternoon heat. He built a small dam of rocks around it, and the water pooled, and frogs came. frogs that had not been seen in this county since 1982, according to the old woman at the general store, who now came by every month with water and bread and stories about the people who had lived here before. Year 7. The 20 trees were now 80. The grass covered 2 acres. Birds came. First the sparrows, then the finches, then a hawk that circled overhead every morning, watching the movement of small animals that had returned because the grass provided cover and the trees provided shade and the spring provided water. Michael, who was now 16 and who had started calling his father Dad again, built a small house from adobe bricks that he made from the clay and the sand. It had 1 room and a window that faced east, and in the morning the sun came through that window and lit up the dust motes like gold. Year 8. A reporter from a newspaper in the city heard about the man who was growing a forest in the desert, and he drove out in a Jeep that got stuck in the sand 2 miles from the property and had to be pulled out by John's truck, which now had 300,000 miles on it and ran on prayers and duct tape. The reporter took photographs of John, standing among trees that were now 10 feet tall, of Michael holding a handful of soil that was black and rich and nothing like the cracked earth that surrounded the property, of the spring that had become a pond that was home to frogs and dragonflies and a turtle that no one could explain. The story ran on page 3 under the headline, "The Farmer Who Would Not Leave," and it was read by 12,000 people, most of whom forgot it by the next day. But one person who read it was a graduate student at the University of Arizona studying hydrology, and she drove out the following week with equipment that John did not understand and questions that he could not answer. She took samples of the clay and the water and the soil, and she went back to her laboratory, and what she found made her call her professor in the middle of the night. The aquifer that John had found was not just water. It was ancient water, 10,000 years old, trapped in a layer of impermeable clay that had been formed by volcanic activity millions of years ago. The clay acted as a natural reservoir, slowly releasing water through cracks that John's trees had widened with their roots. It was a closed system, self-sustaining, a miracle of geology and botany and sheer human stubbornness. The professor came the next month, and then a team came, and then the government came, because water in the desert is not just a curiosity, it is a strategic resource, and they wanted to know if this could be replicated. If John's 40 acres were a fluke or a formula. Year 9. The government offered to buy the land for $2 million. John said no. Year 10. They offered $5 million. John said no, and this time he explained why. He said, "This land is not mine to sell. It belongs to the trees and the frogs and the hawk and my son, who built the house we live in with his own hands." The government men did not understand, but they went away and they wrote a report that was classified for 6 months and then released with most of the details redacted. What was not redacted was the satellite image. A green dot, 40 acres across, in the middle of a brown desert that stretched for 200 miles in every direction. The image was taken by a NASA satellite that was supposed to be monitoring dust storms, and when the technician saw the green dot, he thought it was a glitch. He ran the image 3 times. Then he called his supervisor. Then they called the University of Arizona. Then they called John Miller, who answered the phone in a house made of adobe, surrounded by trees, while a frog sang in the pond that had once been a seep and was now deep enough to swim in. Year 11. Scientists from 3 countries came to study what they were now calling the Miller microclimate. The temperature on John's property was 4 degrees cooler than the surrounding desert. The humidity was 20% higher. The soil, which had been classified as permanently non-arable, now supported 12 species of grass, 8 species of wildflower, and 47 species of insect that had not been documented in this region since the 1950s. The bank that had seized John's original farm sent a representative, a young man in a suit who had not been born when the foreclosure happened, and he offered to finance any expansion John wanted. John said no, but he invited the young man to stay for dinner, and they ate corn that was sweeter than anything the young man had ever tasted. And he went back to the bank and told his bosses that some debts cannot be paid with money. Year 12. It was no longer 40 acres of cracked earth. It was an oasis. 237 trees, ranging from mesquite that were now 30 feet tall to cottonwoods that John had planted in year 8 after finding seeds in a bird's nest. The pond had become a small lake, fed by the aquifer that the trees had opened wider with their roots, a cycle of water and life that sustained itself with no irrigation, no pumps, no human intervention except the initial planting and the patience to wait. The property value of the surrounding land had increased by 400% because people wanted to live near the green, near the water, near the impossible thing that had happened in their midst. Old man Henderson, who was now 87, and who had given John the $100 and the rifle, came to visit in a wheelchair pushed by his grandson. He looked at the trees and the lake and the house that Michael had built, and he cried, and John held his hand, and neither of them said anything because there were no words for what they were seeing. Sarah came back, not to stay, not to rebuild what had been broken, but to see what John had built from nothing, to understand why she had left and what she had missed. She stood at the edge of the lake and watched the dragonflies, and she said, "I am sorry." And John said, "Do not be. The seed does not know the soil is dead. It only knows it has to grow. And some of us are seeds, and some of us are soil, and we find each other when we are ready." Sarah stayed for 3 days, and then she left, and John watched her go, and this time he felt something other than loss. He felt gratitude, because without the leaving, there would have been no digging. Without the digging, there would have been no clay. Without the clay, there would have been no water, and without the water, there would have been no oasis. Michael is 25 now. He runs a program that teaches former farmers how to find water in places that the maps say are dry. He has helped 12 families establish their own microclimates, using the techniques that his father discovered through desperation and luck, and the kind of stubbornness that looks like madness until it works. The government still wants to buy the land, and John still says no, though he has agreed to let them study it, as long as they do not take anything away, and as long as they plant 1 tree for every day they spend there. The last count was 412 trees, and John knows the exact location of each one, because he visits them every morning at dawn, walking through the forest that was once a graveyard, listening to the birds that were once extinct in this county, touching the clay that was once just another layer of rock beneath his feet. He still lives in the adobe house that Michael built, though Michael has added 3 rooms and a porch that faces the lake. He still wakes before dawn, though now he wakes to the sound of water moving through reeds instead of the sound of wind moving through nothing. And he still digs, though now he digs for pleasure, for exercise, for the simple joy of moving earth and finding what is hidden beneath. Last month, a reporter asked him what he would say to the people who laughed, to the bank that took his farm, to the wife who left, to the world that said it was impossible. John thought for a long time, and then he smiled, and he said, "I would tell them that the seed does not know the soil is dead. It only knows it has to grow, and if you are a seed, and you find yourself in dead soil, you do not complain about the soil. You send your roots deeper. You find the water that no one else can see, and you grow, not because the world believes you can, but because growing is the only thing a seed knows how to do." The reporter wrote it down, and it became the headline, and people shared it on the internet, and some of them were inspired to plant their own seeds in their own dead soil, in their own cracked earth, and some of those seeds grew, and some of them did not, but all of them were planted, and that is what matters, because the planting is the point. The growing is the miracle, and the oasis is just what happens when one man refuses to stop digging. John Miller is 64 years old now, and he is still digging, and the sun is still rising, and the trees are still growing, and somewhere out there, someone is holding a seed that could change everything. Maybe that someone is you. Maybe the soil you think is dead is just waiting for someone patient enough to find the water beneath. Maybe the bank has already knocked on your door, and maybe you are sitting on a rock with a rifle and a bullet, wondering if it is worth it to keep going. John would tell you that it is. He would tell you that the darkest hour is not just before the dawn. It is the hour when you decide whether to keep digging or to stop. And he would tell you that the water is there. It is always there. You just have to dig deep enough to find it. So dig, plant, wait, and grow. Because the seed does not know the soil is dead. It only knows it has to grow, and so do you.